And now for our last quickfire question, we have Monique Van Elfen-Fife. I hope I said that properly. Aroha mai if not. So Monique was actually a late addition to this lineup because I have lots of mates that are currently studying law at Vic, and some of them are watching. Hi, Marlon. And I remember some of my friends saying to me, like just explaining to me, because I'm always on this like decolonization tip, right? And they're just like, well, do you understand like the difference between, or like how property rights or people's different understandings that are really the crux of colonization? I had never thought about that before. And I just thought it was so amazing that you have so many students that don't necessarily have a background in being around Māori people in Māori spaces, but they had this really awesome concept and understanding of those fundamental differences. And I thought, like, if you can teach a whole class full of law students that, then you should come on here and have a kōrero, because you're obviously an excellent communicator. And Monique was so humble. She was like, no, like, we don't need more Pākehā voices. Like, I'm all good. Like, surely there's better people. But I was like, no, you are awesome as well. So, and it goes back to that whole part about we all have a role to play. So thank you so much for giving us your time, Monique, and for being here today. So for your question, I was just wondering if you could go more in depth into what you teach as a living, and just talking about, I guess, the underpinnings of property law from a Western perspective, and how these we're in conflict with Māori views of kaitiaki over the whenua.
Tēnā koe, that was it's quite an introduction. I started teaching this year, and as a lawyer in Wellington, I have had I feel like I've got an enormous wallop of privilege, and it's necessary to use it somehow. One of the interesting things I found when I started teaching was that there was quite an extraordinary pressure from the students, rather than necessarily the faculty, to get the stuff into the law curriculum. So I was already going to do it, but it was rather awesome to have a whole bunch of law students really keen on hearing about it. So I'll do a little bit of background around where Pākehā property law concepts came from, and then talk a little bit about how I think that is different from the kind of themes we're seeing through from the other speakers here. And I do preface this by saying I am Pākehā, no more Whakaata, I'm sorry. Aroha mai, and I'm just really privileged to be here. This is unbelievably great, thank you. Pākehā ideas of land stem from medieval times. They are sourced in the sort of feudal relationships between the king, his lords, their tenants and their serfs. And in very basic terms, at that time, having an interest in land came with obligations to the lord to provide financial and military and spiritual support to the lord. So all the serfs would be supplying money, food, and supply resources and obligations to each rung of the ladder as it went all the way up to the king. Now, over time, a lot of these kind of rungs of the ladder just started to kick themselves out because people ended up not having heirs to inherit, and so that rung would disappear and that kind of thing. So eventually the king, everyone held land directly from the king, those who were lucky enough to do so. And so this kind of created this idea of the crown having this underlying ownership of literally all of the land. It's all vested in the crown, and that everybody who has an interest in land has grants from the crown. And so that in a conceptual sense is what is behind a lot of Pākehā land law today. And we've largely done away with that in a practical sense, but it still sits there as this idea behind the crown sovereignty, that they have imperium over what's called imperium, like dominate the right to be sovereign over that particular land. But everybody who owns land, as we sort of colloquially call it, is sort of treated as having full legal ownership, even though there is this conceptual idea that you only hold it on a grant from the crown. Now, this ownership is really, really, really individualistic. It doesn't rest on any kind of pre-existing connection with the land. the basic tenets of land law are that an owner is free to do with it what they want, and they can, usually the idea is that you'll essentially try and make money off it. Because a lot of this is also sourced in there's conceptual philosophical ideas of John Locke, where you had the right to land if you were using it. So you can see a lot of dangerous ideas there as we march along to colonisation. And so owners were free to do with what they wanted, and the idea was to make use of the resources and make money. As long as you didn't interfere with other people's right to use the land, or you didn't harm other people's land, then you could do with what you want. And one of the things that is really, really key to it is this concept of alienation. So you could actually give all of your rights to somebody else, or more appropriately sell them, so that you sever any rights you have to that land by giving it outright to somebody else or transferring it to someone else. And once you give that transfer, once you make that transfer, it doesn't come with obligations to a wider community. There's no obligation to the person who gave it to you. There's no obligation to the community behind that person. It's a very individualistic kind of take, and a very kind of private law kind of take on what these rights and obligations might be with the land, to the land, and to other people. And again, no expectation that you'll look after the land, except to the degree of not interfering with other people's rights. And so in that sense, you can see a lot of threads about so the underlying concept of sovereignty being really important to land, and that being an underlying concept to land and how we disseminate it amongst the population. But you can also see it's really about managing an individual's rights to land and their ability to make money off it, essentially. And the really classic statement of any kind of property is from Blackstone, and he thought that property was a person's sole and despotic dominion over a thing, including land. So obviously, tikanga Māori is in respect of whenua is vastly different. That tikanga that are particularly important to land are whanaungatanga, kaitiakitanga, manakitanga, mana and utu, as well as tapu and noa as a sort of system of managing it as well. And obviously there's a deep and fundamental relationship to the land through whakapapa, the notion that the land itself is an ancestor. It's actually part of your community, and tangata whenua are part of, nourished by the land. And because the land is an ancestor, one of the reasons, is part of the iwi o the hapu, and it's your whanaungatanga, there's a kinship value, and kaitiakitanga has to be exercised over it. And because Te Ao Māori, as Justice Williams says, is all about relationships, manakitanga is also important. So not just looking after the land itself or the people themselves within the land in terms of your community, it's also about being generous to manuhiri, creating and maintaining relationships beyond your group. And I really enjoyed hearing Pania talk about using your resources to welcome manuhiri onto ihumātao. And so that kind of generosity and the caring for the land and the people who relate to it would in turn enhance the mana of the rangatira and the hapu in that area. And so your strength and connections get stronger, and your sort of mana is enhanced. And one of the ways this plays out, and one of the things I think is really, really important to read, is the Waitangi Tribunal's Muri Whenua Land Report, which sets out these differences of approach to land, and particularly contract law in relation to land, on the part of Pākehā and also on the part of Māori, to look at what actually went wrong here when these two kind of things met. So I'll assume that we know enough about contracts for sale that I don't have to really recap that. You just make an agreement and you part ways with the thing, whether it's land or objects. But in terms of transferring an interest in whenua under tikanga, Sir Eddie Jury in the Muri Whenua report notes that tuku, which is what Pākehā sort of interpreted as sale, was in fact a way of incorporating other individuals or groups into the hapu or iwi. It was about creating whanaungatanga links and ensuring that you would enhance your mana by letting these other people use your whenua. So it was never an alienation. It was never a thing that would be severing your links, because you can't do that because of whakapapa and whanaungatanga, that the land is part of who you are. You can't sever those links in that way. So if you were the lucky person who was on the receiving end of a grant of an interest in whenua from Māori, there was obligations to the gifter. So there was these ideas of having to give back in terms of creating that whanaungatanga, maintaining those relationships, kaitiakitanga over the land, manaakitanga to anyone who would come into the land as well. So this aspect of it, this, you get some rights but also receive obligations, was just never recognized. Well, it was not recognised by the vast majority of Pākehā, let's put it that way, at the time. And I think we can all see the result of that around us every day, sort of writ large over the whole entire country. And these concepts reinforce that tikanga is about forming and developing and nurturing relationships with the land and with other communities. And that's a really clearly very different fundamental approach to a Western way of thinking. And it certainly leads on to the constitutional kind of questions, because these two frameworks are so extraordinarily different and stem from such extraordinarily different social and cultural conceptions of what property means, what relationships are, and what your relationship with the land is as well. Yeah.
That's great. I'm sure we all wish that you were the law teacher of property law forever. That everyone had to go through and hear actually all of you talking, because I just find that very helpful and makes a lot of sense to me, just kind of breaking that down. So thank you. And I know later we've got a question for you about how we could maybe move towards. Do you want to say something, Thomas?
Well, I did kind of want to say something, but I'm not really here to say things. I'm here to ask questions. But I did want to say that was so amazing, and I'm going to listen to that again a couple of times. And like, oh man, it's just like, the way we think about land is so messed up. And just the way you started that whole little set of remarks, the fact that Pākehā consideration of law comes from medieval times, and, you know, deference to the king and his lords, and how he can make sure they've got money for war. It's kind of like, well, no wonder it's messed up. I mean, if that's where it's coming from, it just kind of makes me feel like, geez. And then there's I read this other book, which you might know, called Owning the Earth, by this guy, Andrew Linklater. And he was a land surveyor. And he was obsessed with land surveying. And he wrote this book about land tenure types. So ownership, relationships of ownership from different people and cultures and civilizations throughout history to land. And he found basically that the private property society that we have right now, and that derives from that kind of feudal Western medieval system, he described it as a bizarre mutation alien to most of humanity. And yet we kind of think of it as totally normal. And in fact, if you think of it as not normal, then you're considered a complete sort of weirdo, and you can't challenge it. So I feel like anyway, that was just a rant that I needed to get off my chest. But back to you, Dan.